Camp Winters, Texas. October 3, 1944, 7:47 in the evening. The mess hall smelled of cornbread and coffee of 287 men who hadn't bathed properly in 3 weeks of Texas dust that infiltrated everything despite constant sweeping. The air conditioning unit rattled in the corner, fighting a losing battle against October heat that still pushed 90 degrees after sunset. Margaret Schneider stood beside a wooden radio positioned on the front table. Her hands trembled. Sweat darkened the collar of her gray dress despite the struggling AC. She could taste copper in her mouth, that metallic tang of fear she'd learned to recognize over the past 3 years. Fear of being watched, fear of being judged, fear of being found wanting. Behind her, Colonel Nathaniel Hargrove observed with arms crossed, his 48-year-old face revealing nothing. Ahead of her, 287 German prisoners of war sat at long tables, forks suspended over their evening meal, conversations dying into expectant silence. Every eye fixed on the radio, every breath held. The radio was unremarkable, a simple wooden box with dials and a fabric speaker grill. Standard military issue, probably manufactured by the thousands in some factory back east. But in that moment, it dominated the room like an unexploded bomb. Greta's finger hovered over the power dial. She knew what these men expected. They'd been warned about American propaganda for years, told that Allied broadcasts were sophisticated lies designed to break German morale, to poison minds against the fatherland. They expected manipulation disguised as news deception, wrapped in reasonable-sounding voices, psychological warfare dressed as information. She expected something too, but she wasn't sure what. Truth, lies, something between. After 3 years of being suspected, questioned, doubted at every turn, she no longer knew what truth sounded like. The dial clicked. Static filled the room like a physical presence, crackling and hissing through the speaker fabric. Then a voice emerged from the noise, clear and measured, speaking German with a Hamburg accent that sounded like home and betrayal simultaneously. Guten Abend. Dies ist Voice of America, Deutsche Sendung aus New York. Good evening. This is Voice of America German service broadcasting from New York. Greta translated automatically, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, despite the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her every gesture. But her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, questions that had consumed her since August, when Colonel Hargrove had offered her this impossible job. Was she German or American? Both. Neither. Were her parents still alive in Stuttgart? Or had the bombs finally found them in the 7 months since their last letter? Was this broadcast truth or the most sophisticated propaganda she'd ever encountered? Would these prisoners accept her as translator, or always see her as the traitor Captain Keller had called her on arrival? What was in the letter the FBI had confiscated back in April? The last communication from her aunt that she'd never been allowed to read. Could she live with the guilt of being German in America while Germans died by the thousands in Europe? And underneath all the other questions, the one that haunted her dreams: what happened to her brother William? 6 months of silence. 6 months of form letters from the War Department saying his status couldn't be disclosed for security reasons. 6 months of not knowing if he was alive or dead or suffering somewhere she couldn't reach. The VOA announcer continued, his voice calm and professional, reading the evening news with the precision of a man who valued accuracy over emotion. Allied forces advancing in Holland. German defensive positions near Arnhem under sustained pressure. Then the words that made Greta's breath catch. American losses in Operation Market Garden have been heavier than initially reported. British airborne divisions suffering significant casualties. German counterattacks proving more effective than Allied intelligence anticipated. Supply difficulties continue to slow the advance toward the Rhine. She translated mechanically, her voice operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. American losses heavier than reported. German counterattacks effective. Supply difficulties. This wasn't propaganda. Propaganda didn't admit failure. Propaganda didn't acknowledge enemy success. Propaganda painted everything in absolutes: victory and defeat, good and evil, us and them. This was something else entirely. Something that felt like journalism, like truth. The mess hall remained frozen in silence. 287 men listening to words they never expected to hear from an American broadcast. Truth uncomfortable and complicated, delivered without theatrical spin or emotional manipulation. Just facts presented with clinical precision that made them impossible to dismiss as obvious lies. The announcer moved to other news. Pacific theater updates, American domestic challenges with food rationing and factory production. British reports on V2 rocket attacks damaging London. German economic difficulties under sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Truth from all sides. Complexity acknowledged. Problems admitted. No simple narrative of inevitable Allied victory or German collapse. Just the messy reality of a war that both sides were fighting with everything they had. When the broadcast ended 15 minutes later, silence hung in the Texas air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Heavy, oppressive, charged with potential energy waiting to explode. Greta stood perfectly still, hand resting on the radio dial, not daring to turn around and face Colonel Hargrove's judgment or look ahead at the prisoners' reactions. In that moment of suspension, she existed in a space between worlds, belonging to neither, accepted by none, carrying questions that had no answers. Then conversation erupted. German voices arguing, questioning, denying, wondering. The sound crashed over her like a physical wave, and she felt herself drowning in the realization that she'd just participated in something that might transform everything, or destroy everything. She didn't know which yet, but she knew with certainty, born of 3 years living under suspicion, that nothing would be the same after this moment. 3 years earlier, Margaret Schneider had been someone else entirely. In the autumn of 1941, before Pearl Harbor turned the world upside down, she'd been Greta to everyone who knew her. Not Margaret. Never Margaret. Greta Schneider, beloved German teacher at Austin High School, daughter of Joseph and Anna Schneider, who ran the finest bakery in Travis County, proud German-American who taught teenagers about Goethe and Schiller, and the rich cultural heritage that flowed through her veins like music. She'd loved her life with an intensity that seemed naive in retrospect. Loved standing before 25 students, watching their faces light up when they finally grasped German grammar's elegant logic. Loved Sunday dinners at her parents' house, where the smell of fresh-baked bread mixed with her mother's perfect sauerbraten. Loved her father's stories about the Rhineland he'd left behind in 1920. Loved her brother William's terrible jokes and worse singing voice. She'd been content. Safe. Thoroughly, completely American. Then December 7th arrived with news that shattered everything. The first brick came through the bakery window at 2 in the morning. Greta had been sleeping when the phone rang, her father's voice shaking as he described the shattered glass, the note wrapped around the brick in crude handwriting. Go back to Hitler, Nazi lovers. By morning, 3 more windows had been broken. By afternoon, customers who'd bought bread from the Schneiders for 20 years crossed the street to avoid walking past the shop. By evening, the FBI arrived to ask questions about loyalty, allegiance, and whether the Schneiders had any contact with family still in Germany. They had. Letters arrived monthly from Stuttgart from Anna's sister Margaret and her family, cheerful notes about daily life and shared memories and love, sent across an ocean that was rapidly becoming an unbridgeable divide. The FBI confiscated every letter, took them as evidence of potential espionage, potential disloyalty, potential treason. Never mind that the letters discussed recipes and weather and the normal minutiae of family life. They were German, written in German, sent from Germany. That was enough. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Austin High School's principal called Greta into his office. He didn't meet her eyes when he spoke, his discomfort palpable in the small space. We can't have a German teacher during wartime, Miss Schneider. You understand. Parents are concerned. The school board voted unanimously. I'm sorry. She'd understood. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. Didn't make the walk out of the building any easier, her colleagues averting their eyes, students whispering as she passed. By January 1942, the bakery was closed. Joseph and Anna couldn't afford to keep it running without customers, and customers wouldn't return to a business owned by Germans, even Germans who'd been Americans for 20 years. Who'd paid taxes and followed laws and believed in democracy with the fervor of the converted. The Schneiders retreated into their homes, speaking in whispers, even they're afraid that German spoken anywhere might draw suspicion. Greta stopped being Greta. She introduced herself as Margaret, let her German accent flatten into something more neutral, avoided speaking German even with her parents. She was trying to disappear, to become invisible, to survive in a country that had suddenly decided her heritage made her an enemy. The FBI came 3 times that spring, 3 separate interrogations, 3 separate searches of their home, 3 separate warnings about the consequences of disloyalty. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The Schneiders were loyal Americans who happened to have German blood, German relatives in a German language that had become dangerous to speak aloud. William enlisted in the army in March 1943. Not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to prove something. Wanted to show that German Americans could be patriots too. Wanted to erase the suspicion that followed his family like a stain that wouldn't wash out. He shipped out to England in May. His letters home were cheerful and heavily censored, full of reassurances that he was safe, that the war would be over soon, that everything would return to normal when he came home. The letters stopped in April 1944. Greta wrote to the War Department. They sent back a form letter stating that her brother's unit was engaged in operations and individual status updates couldn't be provided for security reasons. She wrote again. Another form letter identical to the first. Then in July, the FBI came again, not to interrogate this time, to confiscate. A letter had arrived from Stuttgart from her Aunt Margaret. The FBI agent wouldn't tell Greta what it said, wouldn't let her read the words her aunt had written. Just took the envelope unopened by anyone except censors and added it to some file in some office where evidence of potential disloyalty was catalogued and stored. That was the last communication from Germany. 4 months of silence followed. 4 months of not knowing if her parents' relatives were alive or dead, if Stuttgart still stood or had been reduced to rubble, if the family connections that had once seemed so important even existed anymore. August brought unexpected salvation in an unexpected form. The U.S. Army needed German translators, desperately. The flood of prisoners from Normandy had overwhelmed the system's capacity, and qualified translators were scarce. Someone in the War Department must have looked at Greta's file and seen past the suspicion to the skills underneath. German teacher, fluent speaker, impeccable grammar, no criminal record, no actual evidence of disloyalty, just heritage and catastrophically bad timing. Colonel Nathaniel Hargrove interviewed her in a spare office at Fort Sam Houston on a sweltering August morning. He was 48, career military, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He spoke German fluently, his accent suggesting he'd studied in Heidelberg before the war made such things impossible. "You want to prove your loyalty, Miss Schneider?" His voice was neutral, neither kind nor cruel, just professionally assessing. "Yes, sir." "Then come work for me. Camp Winters needs a translator. POW Camp German Prisoners daily broadcasts from Voice of America, letter translations, official announcements. You'll live on site under observation. You'll be monitored constantly. You'll be trusted with nothing except language itself. But if you do the work well, if you serve honorably, your file will reflect that service." She'd said yes before he finished explaining the conditions. Yes to living in a guard barracks under surveillance. Yes to constant monitoring. Yes to working among men who might hate her for helping their captors, or Americans who might hate her for being German. Yes to anything that might prove she belonged somewhere, that she could be trusted with something, that she had value beyond the suspicion that had defined her existence for 3 years. She started September 15, 1944. The same day, 287 German prisoners arrived at Camp Winters after 3 weeks at sea and 2 weeks in processing facilities. The camp sprawled across Texas prairie, 20 miles outside Austin. a temporary city of wooden barracks and wire fencing that looked almost gentle in the September heat. No guard towers bristling with machine guns, no searchlights cutting through darkness. No visible brutality or overt cruelty. Just 12 barracks arranged in neat rows, a mess hall large enough to feed 300, an administration building, a small hospital, a chapel, an endless dust that covered everything, no matter how often anything was swept. Colonel Hargrove's office occupied the second floor of the administration building, windows overlooking the main compound where prisoners would spend their days working on local farms or maintaining the camp itself. The walls were lined with books on military history and international law. The desk meticulously organized everything about the space, suggesting a man who valued order and precision. He gestured for Greta to sit that first morning, his expression impossible to read. "You'll translate Voice of America broadcasts every evening at 19:30 hours. You'll process all incoming and outgoing mail, translating as needed, but never editorializing or adding personal interpretation. You'll assist with camp announcements and official instructions. You'll teach basic English to any prisoners who request it, and basic German to any guards who need it for their duties." He'd paused, studying her face with those assessing eyes. "You will not express political opinions about the war or its conduct. You will not discuss your personal views on Germany, America, or any related topics. You will translate accurately and completely without adding your own interpretations or judgments. Do you understand these restrictions?" "Yes, sir." "You're here to prove loyalty through service, Miss Schneider. Service means fidelity to accuracy, not to ideology. You translate what is said, not what you wish was said or what you think should be said. Truth is more important than comfort. Remember that." He'd opened a desk drawer and removed a manila envelope sealed and unmarked except for her name, written in precise handwriting. "Open this on Christmas Eve, not before." She'd taken it, confused by the instruction. "What is it, sir?" "Something you'll understand when the time is right. Trust requires patience, Miss Schneider. You'll learn that here." The envelope sat in her desk drawer, now 3 months away from revelation. One more question added to the pile of unanswered questions that defined her existence. Sergeant Ellis Buchanan had shown her to her quarters that first afternoon. He was 32, a high school teacher from Houston before the war, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that seemed incongruous with military uniform. His German was adequate, learned from tutoring refugee students in the late 30s, and he spoke it with the careful precision of someone who'd studied diligently but never achieved natural fluency. "Colonel Hargrove is fair," Buchanan had said as they walked across the compound in brutal afternoon heat. "Strict about regulations, inflexible about Geneva Convention protocols, but genuinely fair. He treats prisoners like human beings and expects them to act like human beings in return. Most do. Some don't, but that's human nature. What happens to the ones who don't? Solitary confinement for serious infractions. Loss of privileges for minor ones. Standard disciplinary measures, nothing cruel or unusual. Hargrove won't tolerate cruelty from guards or prisoners. He believes civilization requires that standard even in wartime." Her quarters were Spartan but adequate. A small room in the guards' barracks, single bed with thin mattress, wooden desk and chair. Tiny closet window overlooking the mess hall. The walls were bare, painted institutional beige, offering no comfort but no particular discomfort either. Buchanan had lingered in the doorway, something thoughtful in his expression. "My father was in the last war," he'd said quietly. "Came home with stories about German prisoners working on Texas farms during 1918. Said they were treated decently, worked hard, and some of them stayed after the war ended. Became Americans, married local women, raised families here." He'd paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "He always said that treating enemies with dignity didn't make you weak. It made you civilized. It proved you were fighting for something worth preserving, not just against something you hated. I think about that a lot these days, wonder if we're proving the same thing here." Then he'd left, and Greta had unpacked her single suitcase in silence, arranging her few possessions in a room that felt simultaneously like a prison cell, and the first safe space she'd had in 3 years. She'd brought almost nothing. 3 gray dresses, undergarments, a pair of wool gloves her mother had knitted and sent in winter 1943 before the silence began. A German-English dictionary, teaching materials from her previous life, and one photograph that she couldn't look at but couldn't discard. She'd placed it face down on the desk, a rectangle of hidden truth she wasn't ready to confront. Couldn't confront. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Meeting the prisoners had been worse than she'd imagined. Colonel Hargrove had assembled them in the mess hall that first afternoon. 287 men in worn Wehrmacht uniforms that showed every sign of recent combat. Their faces displayed every shade of emotion: defiance, despair, exhaustion, uncertainty, anger, fear. They stood at attention while Hargrove addressed them in flawless German, his accent Heidelberg perfect. "You are prisoners of war under protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law without exception. You will work on local farms and camp maintenance. You will be adequately fed and housed. You will receive medical care as needed." He'd paused, letting his words settle. "We have one amenity that most camps provide: access to radio broadcasts. Evening news in German from Voice of America, cultural programming, music. Information is not a weapon to be feared. It is simply information. What you choose to believe is your decision." Greta had stood beside him, hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes evaluating her. German eyes. Eyes that saw a woman in American territory speaking their language, standing with their captors. Hargrove had gestured toward her. "This is Miss Schneider. She will serve as translator for broadcast letters and official announcements. She is civilian personnel, and you will treat her with the respect owed to any non-combatant. She is here to facilitate communication, nothing more." The murmur had started immediately, low voices questioning, skeptical, hostile. Then one voice louder than the rest, cutting through the murmur like a blade. "Verräterin!" Traitor. The word hit Greta like a physical blow. She'd forced herself not to react, not to show the pain it caused, not to let them see how deeply it wounded. But inside, something cracked. Captain Friedrich Keller had stepped forward from the assembled prisoners. 45 years old, career soldier, Iron Cross visible on his uniform, tunic, face hard as Texas limestone and twice as unforgiving. His eyes locked on Greta with pure contempt. "You're German," he'd said in German, making it an accusation rather than an observation. "And you work for them, for the enemies of the fatherland." Hargrove's voice had been ice. "Captain Keller, step back into formation." Keller hadn't moved. "She should know what we think of Germans who betray their own people to serve the enemy. The enemy is defined as combatants shooting at you, Captain. Miss Schneider is a civilian translator performing a service. Now step back before I have you confined to quarters for insubordination." The moment had stretched taut as wire about to snap. Then Keller had stepped back, but his eyes never left Greta's face, and the contempt never faded from his expression. Another voice had broken the hostile silence. Younger, less aggressive, more curious than hostile. "Where in Germany are you from, Miss?" Greta had found the speaker. A man in his late 20s, lieutenant's insignia, visible face showing more curiosity than hostility. "My parents immigrated from Stuttgart," she'd answered carefully, choosing words precisely. "I was born here in Texas." "Stuttgart." The lieutenant had nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "My wife is from Stuttgart, beautiful city, or it was before." He'd trailed off, the past tense hanging in the air between them like an accusation or a shared grief, or both, simultaneously. "I'm Klaus Werner," he'd continued. "Panzer Corps captured at Caen 3 weeks ago." "Thomas Weber," another voice had added. 31-years-old tank commander by his insignia, with intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything and judge carefully before speaking. "Also Caen, also captured, also wondering what happened to Stuttgart since we left France." Greta had swallowed hard against sudden emotion. "I don't know what happened to Stuttgart. I haven't heard from there since April. 7 months of silence." Something had shifted in Weber's expression then. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. Understanding that she was as cut off from Germany as they were, as uncertain about loved ones' fates, as trapped between worlds with no clear allegiance possible. That first night she'd lain awake in her narrow bed, listening to distant voices speaking German through the thin barracks walls, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her entire life. German but not German enough for the prisoners. American but not American enough for the guards. Translator but trusted by absolutely no one. The mystery envelope sat in her desk drawer 3 months from revelation. The photograph lay face down beside it, truth she couldn't confront. Questions without answers circled endlessly in her mind like vultures over carrion. Outside her window, Camp Winters settled into uneasy sleep, 287 prisoners and 50 guards existing in a liminal space between war and peace, enemy and human suspicion and tentative coexistence. Tomorrow evening would bring the first broadcast. Tomorrow evening everything would begin to change. October 3rd arrived with brutal heat that made the mess hall feel like an oven, despite the struggling air conditioning. For 3 weeks, small test broadcasts had played in individual barracks. VOA German service, just background noise while men ate or cleaned or tried to sleep. Some prisoners listened, most ignored it. Keller and his hardcore Nazi followers had actively avoided it, treating the radio like a source of contamination. But tonight was different. Tonight was the first mandatory mass broadcast. Colonel Hargrove's order delivered that morning, 1930 hours. Mess hall. All prisoners required to attend. Voice of America German service. Greta had spent the day in controlled panic, translating letters with hands that shook, teaching English to 6 prisoners. While her mind fixated on the evening, wondering what would happen, how they would react, whether this would end in disaster. At 1700 hours, the evening meal began. The kitchen had prepared something approaching decent food: roasted chicken with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, weak coffee. Better than what the prisoners had eaten in France, probably better than what civilians were eating in Germany. Thomas Weber sat at a center table, his plate half empty. His attention clearly elsewhere. Klaus Werner picked at his food absently. Captain Keller ate with mechanical precision, his face showing nothing, his very stillness suggesting tension coiled tight. At 1925, Sergeant Buchanan positioned the radio on the front table. At 1928, guards took positions at strategic points around the room. At 1930 exactly, Colonel Hargrove entered and nodded to Greta. Her hands shook as she turned on the radio, static, then that Hamburg accent clear and professional. Guten Abend, dies ist Voice of America. And the transformation began. When the broadcast ended 15 minutes later, when silence crashed over the mess hall like a wave, Greta knew with absolute certainty that she had just participated in something that would change everything. The arguments started immediately. German voices raised in debate, in denial, in questioning. Guards watched carefully but didn't intervene. Hargrove observed from the back of the room, his expression unreadable. And Greta stood beside the silent radio, belonging to neither world, accepted by neither side, wondering if she'd just helped plant seeds of transformation or simply created new reasons for people to hate her. Tomorrow there would be another broadcast, and another, and another. 3 months until Christmas Eve, when she could open Hargrove's envelope and learn what mystery it contained. 7 months since her parents' last letter. 8 months since William's last communication. Questions without answers. Truths without certainty. Identity without clarity. She was Margaret Greta Schneider, translator, standing in the space between worlds. Translating words that might change men's minds or might only deepen their certainty that Americans were masters of sophisticated deception. Tomorrow would tell. October became a rhythm of repetition that felt both numbing and terrifying. Every morning at 6, Greta woke to Texas sun already burning through her window, turning the small room into an oven despite the early hour. Every morning she dressed in one of her 3 gray dresses, pinned her dark hair back with the precision her mother had taught her 20 years ago. and walked alone across the compound to the guards' mess for breakfast she could barely tint. The guards ate in silence around her. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. She existed in a category they didn't know how to process: civilian but living on base, German but working for America woman in a space dominated by men and military protocol. They nodded politely when she entered, moved aside to let her pass, but never invited her to sit, never included her in their conversations. She ate alone at the corner table every morning. Scrambled eggs that were always slightly rubbery, bacon that was too crispy or not crispy enough, toast that scraped the roof of her mouth, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed yesterday and reheated this morning. The food was adequate but joyless fuel rather than nourishment. By 8, she was at her desk in the small office adjacent to Hargrove's, translating letters. The letters arrived in canvas bags pre-sorted by camp censors who read every word before they reached her. Outgoing letters from prisoners to families in Germany, incoming letters from Germany to prisoners. She translated mechanically, converting German longing into English bureaucracy, trying not to feel the weight of other people's grief embedded in every carefully chosen word. A 19-year-old farm boy from Bavaria writing to his mother, "Tell father the Americans give us more food than we had in France. Strange to say, but true. I think of home every night, of your potato soup, of sleeping in my own bed. Tell everyone I am safe." An artillery sergeant writing to his wife, "I don't know when I will see you again. The war feels endless from here, but I am alive and that must be enough for now." A lieutenant writing to his sister in Hamburg, "How bad is it there? The American broadcasts say the city has been bombed repeatedly. I pray you are safe. I pray our parents are safe. I pray this war ends before there is nothing left to come home to." That last one had made Greta's hands freeze over the typewriter keys. Hamburg, bombed repeatedly. Like Stuttgart, probably. Like every German city that housed industry or infrastructure or simply existed in the path of Allied strategy. Were her parents safe, or were they already gone, buried under rubble while she sat in Texas translating other people's desperate hopes? She'd finished the translation with shaking fingers, filed it in the appropriate folder, and immediately started the next letter to avoid thinking about questions that had no answers. By noon, the morning's letters were complete. Lunch was a silent affair in the guards' mess, Sergeant Buchanan sometimes sitting across from her. Sometimes not, his presence a kindness that required no acknowledgement. Afternoons brought English lessons in a small classroom that had probably been a storage room before the camp opened. 6 prisoners had requested instruction. Klaus Werner, whose eagerness suggested he was already imagining a future in America. 2 young infantrymen barely out of their teens. A cook who thought English might help him find work after repatriation. A mechanic who wanted to read American technical manuals. And occasionally Thomas Weber, whose English was already quite good but who seemed to attend more for the company than the instruction. Greta taught them basic grammar, common phrases, pronunciation that felt clumsy in German mouths. She corrected, gently praised small victories, tried to create a space where learning felt safe, rather than like another form of indoctrination. But the evenings defined everything. At 19:30 every night, the mess hall filled with 287 prisoners. And Greta stood beside the wooden radio that was becoming the gravitational center of their universe. Every night she translated Voice of America German service into a silence that evolved from hostile to skeptical to genuinely attentive. VOA didn't lie. That became undeniable as October progressed. When they reported Allied advances, those advances were confirmed by American newspapers, the guards read by work details who overheard civilian conversations, by the simple fact that more German prisoners arrived weekly from France and Belgium and Holland. When they reported Allied setbacks, those setbacks appeared in American papers too. The slow grinding advance through France that cost more lives than optimistic predictions had suggested. The supply problems that stretched logistics to breaking point. The German defensive positions that held longer than Allied intelligence had expected. When they reported German military successes, they did so without shame or qualification. Effective counterattacks, defensive strategies that delayed Allied advances, the stubborn competence of Wehrmacht units that refused to collapse despite overwhelming material disadvantage. The truth was complicated, messy, uncomfortable for everyone. Neither side perfect, neither side purely evil, both locked in a struggle that consumed lives with industrial efficiency. And that complexity more than anything convinced men who'd been fed simple certainties all their lives that perhaps this wasn't propaganda disguised as news. The first real conversation with Thomas Weber happened on October 11th after the evening broadcast had concluded and prisoners were filing back to barracks. Greta was wrapping the radio's electrical cord when Weber approached, his small notebook tucked under one arm. His face showed the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to reveal too much in uncertain situations. "Miss Schneider." His voice was polite, precisely calibrated. She looked up, immediately wary. "Herr Weber." He gestured to the nearest table. "May I speak with you briefly? I have a question." Every guard in the room was watching. Sergeant Buchanan stood near the exit, posture relaxed, but attention clearly focused on this interaction. Colonel Hargrove observed from his position at the back, face revealing nothing. Greta nodded and sat. Weber settled across from her, the notebook positioned between them like a demilitarized zone. "I need to ask you something." He began choosing words with visible care. "I may not be able to answer." "I understand, but I need to ask anyway." He paused. "Why do you work for them?" "For the Americans." The question hit like a fist to the solar plexus. Greta felt her face flush hot, felt anger and shame and defensiveness all tangling together into something she couldn't quite name or control. "Why did you fight for yours?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edges visible. Weber didn't flinch. Instead, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Respect, maybe. "Fair question," he admitted quietly. "I fought because I was conscripted, because everyone I knew was fighting, because the alternative was execution for desertion or cowardice." He paused, considering his next words. "And because I believed for a long time that we were defending the fatherland, that our cause was just. And now I'm not certain what I believe anymore. The ground keeps shifting under my feet." Silence stretched between them, charged with questions neither could safely ask. Buchanan shifted position near the exit but didn't intervene. The other guards watched carefully, hands resting near weapons they probably wouldn't need but couldn't afford to ignore. "I work here," Greta said finally, quietly, "because it's the only way to prove I'm loyal. Because my family has been under suspicion since Pearl Harbor. Because I was fired from my teaching position, because my parents' bakery was destroyed by people who used to be customers, because the FBI has interrogated us 3 times, looking for evidence of treason they'll never find." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I work here because translating seemed like service that might matter. Because maybe if I serve honorably, people will stop assuming I'm the enemy just because my parents speak German." Weber absorbed this, his face showing the concentration of someone processing new information that contradicted previous assumptions. "Do you believe VOA tells the truth?" "I don't know what I believe. I only know they report things I wouldn't expect propaganda to report. They admit American failures. They acknowledge German successes. That doesn't match what propaganda is supposed to sound like." Weber opened his notebook, showed her pages of neat handwriting in German script. Columns and comparisons, dates and claims, a methodical accounting that spoke to an analytical mind. "I've been documenting everything," he explained. "What VOA reports now versus what German radio told us before capture. About battles we participated in directly, about situations we witnessed with our own eyes. And what have you found? VOA has been accurate approximately 90% of the time. Specific details, casualty figures, tactical outcomes. When I can verify their claims against my own experience, they match." He closed the notebook carefully. German radio, on the other hand, lied consistently. Not about everything, but about enough that I can't trust anything it reported. Greta's throat tightened. My family receives letters from Stuttgart. They say everything is manageable, that they're surviving. VOA says the city has been heavily bombed, that civilian casualties are significant. Perhaps, Weber said with careful gentleness, they tell you everything is manageable because they don't want you to worry. Because they know you can't help them from here. Because what else can they write in letters that censors will read? The possibility hadn't fully occurred to her before. Or rather it had, but she'd pushed it away, unwilling to accept that her parents might be protecting her from truths she couldn't change. Perhaps we're both learning the same lesson, Weber continued, that the people we trusted most were lying to us, for different reasons with different intentions, but lying nonetheless. He stood, tucked the notebook away, offered a slight nod that carried more weight than casual courtesy. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Schneider. It's rare these days. After he left, Greta sat alone at the table for several minutes, Buchanan waiting patiently by the exit, questions multiplying in her mind faster than answers could form. The second conversation happened on October 19th after the English lesson had concluded and most students had returned to their barracks. Weber had started attending regularly, sitting in the back row, participating minimally but listening with intense focus. When the others filed out, he lingered, approaching Greta's desk as she gathered teaching materials. Your English is already quite proficient, she observed. You don't really need these lessons. No, I don't, he agreed without pretense. I worked in import-export before conscription, dealt with British and American firms. English was essential. Then why attend? To understand how you think, how you teach, what you choose to emphasize and what you avoid. The honesty was both refreshing and unsettling. Greta set down her materials, giving him her full attention. Last night's VOA broadcast, Weber said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. They reported that my Panzer Division was destroyed at Caen. 90% casualties, they claimed. Scattered survivors, unit rendered combat ineffective. Greta remembered. She'd translated those specific words, had watched Weber's face go carefully blank as she spoke them. I was there, he continued. I know it's true. We were obliterated. Allied air superiority, artillery concentrations, coordinated tank assaults. We didn't stand a chance. He moved to the window, looked out at Texas prairie, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far from European battlefields. But how do American broadcasters know such specific details? Unit designations, casualty percentages, tactical dispositions, that level of intelligence shouldn't be available to civilian media. Perhaps because they're reporting what military intelligence provides. Perhaps because they have multiple sources inside Germany and occupied territories. Perhaps because they're doing actual investigative journalism instead of inventing convenient fictions. Weber turned back to face her. In Germany, all newspapers published identical stories, same headlines, same phrasing, same government-approved narrative. Here I've seen American newspapers on work details. Different papers report things differently. They argue with each other, contradict each other publicly. And that bothers you. It confuses me. Which system is propaganda? The one where everyone agrees perfectly, or the one where everyone argues constantly? Greta considered the question carefully. Maybe the one that doesn't allow disagreement is the one you should question most. Something shifted in Weber's expression then. A crack in certainty, or maybe an acknowledgement of cracks that had been forming for weeks. You're questioning too, he observed. Not an accusation. An identification of kinship. Every single day. Good. He picked up his notebook from where he'd set it down. My grandmother used to say that certainty is the luxury of the foolish. The wise live with doubt and questions. I never understood what she meant until now. After he left, Greta stood in the empty classroom thinking about certainty and doubt, and the courage required to live between them. By late October, the camp's social geography had crystallized into 3 distinct territories. Captain Keller's faction controlled perhaps 30% of the prisoners. Hardcore true believers who refused to listen to VOA broadcasts, who covered their ears or hummed German marching songs to drown out Greta's translations. They ate together at designated tables, worked together on assigned details, created an island of rigid certainty in a sea of growing doubt. Keller watched Greta with hatred that felt physical. She could feel his eyes tracking her across the compound, could hear him muttering, "Verräterin," just loud enough to reach her ears when she passed. The contempt never softened, never wavered, never acknowledged any possibility that his certainty might be misplaced. The middle group comprised perhaps 50%. Men who listened to VOA but hadn't decided what to believe yet. Thomas Weber belonged here along with most older soldiers who'd seen enough war to be skeptical of any simple narrative. They debated among themselves, constantly arguing about whether the broadcasts could be trusted, whether American honesty was sophisticated manipulation or genuine journalism. And then the converts. Klaus Werner led perhaps 20% of the camp prisoners who'd accepted that VOA was more truthful than anything German radio had ever broadcast. Mostly younger soldiers who'd been drafted rather than volunteering men, who'd never fully believed Nazi ideology, who'd fought because the alternative was death or disgrace, but who'd never been true believers. The divisions created constant tension. Arguments erupted during meals, during work details, during evening hours when men had nothing to do but think and talk and try to reconcile what they were hearing with what they'd believed. On October 24th, Thomas Weber found Greta in the camp library, a small room containing perhaps 200 books in German and English, donated by Austin churches. He was reading a week-old Austin American Statesman that guards had passed along after finishing it. She'd been searching for German poetry to use in her English lessons. He looked up when she entered, no surprise in his expression, as if he'd been waiting for her. "The newspaper confirms VOA," he said without preamble, gesturing to the paper spread across the table before him. "I've been cross-referencing for 2 weeks. When VOA reports something, American newspapers confirm it within days. When newspapers report something, VOA confirms it in subsequent broadcasts." He pushed the paper toward her. Headlines about Allied advances into Germany proper, about production challenges in American war industries, about congressional debates over post-war planning for occupied territories. Independent sources reaching identical conclusions through separate investigations. Weber continued, his tone analytical rather than emotional. "That's how you distinguish truth from coordinated lies. Lies require central control and message discipline. Truth emerges organically from multiple independent sources." Greta sat down across from him, studying his face. "Are you trying to convince me or yourself?" "Probably both." A slight smile, the first she'd seen from him, barely visible but genuine. "I kept a private journal before capture. Documented what German radio reported versus what I observed directly. The discrepancies were substantial." "Tell me." German radio claimed Britain was starving, civilian morale collapsing, on the verge of surrender. But British POWs we captured in France were better fed than we were, better equipped, better supplied. German radio said American soldiers were cowardly, undisciplined, would flee at first contact. But Americans at Normandy fought with ferocity and competence that exceeded our best units. German radio reported strategic victories and orderly withdrawals, but I watched us retreat in chaos, bleeding men and equipment we had no capacity to replace. He closed the newspaper with careful precision. "I think I knew even then that we were being systematically deceived. But knowing and accepting are vastly different. Accepting means admitting that everything you fought for, everyone you watched die, all the suffering and sacrifice was based on lies. That's more difficult than you might imagine." "I understand," Greta said quietly. "My family's letters from Stuttgart say they're managing, that conditions are tolerable. VOA says the city has suffered catastrophic bombing, that civilian casualties are devastating. I don't know which truth to believe. Believe the source that has no incentive to lie to you. And how do I determine which that is?" Weber met her eyes directly. "I think you already know. You're just afraid of what accepting that knowledge will cost you." November 8th arrived with unseasonable cold that made Texans complain while the German prisoners smiled at what they considered mild weather. A northern front had pushed temperatures into the low 40s, unusual for Texas, but nothing compared to Russian winters or even German autumns. The prisoners wore issued jackets and pretended not to notice the cold while Texan guards bundled up as if facing Arctic conditions. The evening meal was better than usual. Roasted pork with applesauce, boiled potatoes with butter, carrots seasoned with herbs. Cornbread still warm from the oven, real coffee instead of the usual weak substitute. The kitchen staff had outdone themselves and the mess hall smelled like comfort and abundance. Greta stood beside the radio at 1930 as usual, her hands steady now after 6 weeks of practice, her translations flowing with automatic precision. Tonight's VOA broadcast was special programming, a detailed retrospective on the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. Information that had been suppressed in Germany, whispered about in fearful tones, but never officially acknowledged, was now being presented with documentary thoroughness. The announcer methodically laid out facts, names of the conspirators, details of Colonel von Stauffenberg's bomb plot, the conference room explosion, Hitler's survival through chance positioning, the brutal reprisals that followed. Greta translated each word while watching tension build in the room like atmospheric pressure before a thunderstorm. Captain Keller sat at his usual table surrounded by his hardcore followers, his face darkening with each sentence Greta spoke. The broadcast continued. Von Stauffenberg's execution, the show trials, hangings filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. The purge of Wehrmacht officer corps, thousands arrested on suspicion of insufficient loyalty. The message sent to Germany's military dissent equals death. Lies. Keller's voice shattered the broadcast like breaking glass. All lies, American propaganda designed to make us doubt the Führer, to poison our minds against legitimate leadership. The announcer continued speaking. Greta continued translating, though her voice wavered slightly at the interruption. Details of the conspiracy's motivation. The officers' belief that Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction. Their attempt to negotiate peace with Western allies before Soviet forces reached Berlin. Their conviction that Germany could still be saved if Hitler was removed. Keller stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward onto concrete floor. This is poison being pumped into your minds. Can't you see they're fabricating elaborate stories about internal German dissent to make you question everything? Classic psychological manipulation. Thomas Weber's voice cut through the rising noise, calm and measured as always. I was in France when this happened. Our officers were terrified that week. Communication broke down. Something significant occurred, Keller. Maybe not exactly as VOA reports, but something real happened. Rumors spread by defeatists and traitors. Keller's face was red now, tendons visible in his neck, his entire body rigid with fury barely contained. By cowards who want us to accept enemy lies as truth. The broadcast continued. Greta's voice continued. The translator's role demanded neutrality, demanded that she simply convert words without editorializing or stopping regardless of disruption. But Keller had stopped listening to the broadcast entirely. He lunged toward the radio. Time fractured into slow motion and impossible speed simultaneously. Keller's hands reaching for the wooden box. Thomas Weber moving to intercept faster than seemed possible. Bodies colliding with audible impact. The table tipping sideways, the radio sliding, then steadied by Weber's quick reflexes. Guards rushed forward, Buchanan reaching Keller first. 2 other soldiers immediately assisting. They grabbed the captain, pulled him away from the overturned furniture, and Keller's voice screaming now in German that needed no translation, words meant to wound as deeply as possible. Your parents are dead. Stuttgart is rubble, your whole family is gone, and you stand there translating American lies that celebrate their destruction. The words hit Greta with physical force. Her vision blurred. Her hands went numb. The mess hall spun slightly as if the room had tilted on its axis. Dead. Rubble. Gone. Colonel Hargrove's voice cut through the chaos like a command that couldn't be questioned. Captain Keller, you are confined to solitary, effective immediately. Remove him from this mess hall. Keller fought as guards dragged him toward the exit, still shouting, his voice growing hoarse. She needs to know the truth. Her precious VOA won't tell her that Stuttgart was destroyed in August, that the people she's helping murdered her own family. The door slammed shut. Silence crashed over the mess hall like a physical weight. Hargrove's voice quieter now, but carrying clearly. The broadcast is concluded for this evening. Return to barracks. Weber, right that table and secure the radio. Miss Schneider. But Greta was already moving, stumbling toward the exit, vision swimming with tears she couldn't control, throat closing around sobs she refused to release in front of 287 pairs of watching eyes. She made it to her quarters, slammed the door, collapsed onto her narrow bed. 7 months since the last letter from Stuttgart. 7 months of silence. 7 months of telling herself that no news might be good news, that mail was simply delayed, that her parents were managing somehow. But Keller's words had given voice to the terror she'd been suppressing since April. Dead. Rubble. Gone. Was it true, or was it cruelty, words chosen specifically to wound her in revenge for her work translating broadcasts he hated? She didn't know, had no way of knowing. The uncertainty was worse than any certain truth could possibly be. A soft knock on her door, gentle, tentative. Miss Schneider, Sergeant Buchanan's voice. May I come in? She couldn't answer, couldn't speak around the grief choking her. The door opened anyway. Buchanan entered quietly, closed it behind him, stood uncertainly in the small space that suddenly felt too confined. Keller was trying to hurt you, he said gently. He may not even know if what he said is true. He was angry, lashing out at the nearest target. But it might be true. Her voice came out, broken, barely recognizable as her own. It might be, or it might not be. 7 months is a long time, but mail from Germany is extremely unreliable right now. Silence doesn't necessarily mean the worst. She sat up slowly, wiped her face with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. How can you possibly know that? Buchanan was quiet for a long moment, choosing words carefully. My brother was at Pearl Harbor, stationed on the USS Arizona. I didn't hear anything for 6 weeks afterward. Didn't know if he'd survived, if he'd drowned, if he'd burned alive when the ship exploded. The not knowing was worse than any certain knowledge would have been. What happened to him? He lived. Had been transferred off the Arizona 2 days before the attack. Pure luck, pure chance. But those 6 weeks before I found out. He shook his head. I understand uncertainty. I understand how it devours you from inside. Greta stared at her hands, at the wool gloves her mother had knitted and sent in 1943, lying on her desk like relics from a previous life. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she whispered. Keep doing what? Translating. Standing there broadcasting news that might be reporting my own family's deaths. How do I keep serving when I don't know if I'm complicit in destroying my own blood? Buchanan pulled the desk chair over, sat down carefully, his kind face showing genuine concern. Can I tell you what I think? She nodded. I think you keep doing it because the work matters. Because those men are learning to question what they've been told their entire lives. Because truth is more important than comfortable ignorance, even when truth is agonizing. Even when truth might destroy everything you hoped was real. He paused, letting his words settle. And I think you keep doing it because stopping won't bring your parents back if they're gone, won't change their fate if they're alive, won't alter anything except your own integrity and the transformation happening in those barracks. What if I can't? What if I'm not strong enough? Then you can't, and that would be understandable. No one could fault you. But I don't think you're the kind of person who stops just because things become difficult. I think you're the kind who keeps going precisely because it's difficult. He stood, moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the knob. Colonel Hargrove wanted me to check on you. He says take tomorrow off if you need it. Rest, process. We can skip tomorrow's broadcast if necessary. You can decide after that whether you want to continue. After he left, Greta lay in darkness, listening to Camp Winters settling into night. Distant German voices, guards changing shifts, wind rattling her window, the the ordinary sounds of a place existing between worlds. On her desk, her mother's gloves, proof of love sent across distance, possibly the last thing her mother would ever make for her. Beside them, the manila envelope. Open Christmas Eve. 6 weeks away, 7 months since her parents' last letter, 7 hours until she had to decide whether she had the courage to continue. Tomorrow, November 9th, would be the first day without a broadcast since October 3rd. Tomorrow she would choose serve truth or protect herself from what truth might reveal. She didn't sleep that night, but by dawn she knew what her choice would be. She didn't sleep that night. As Texas darkness slowly surrendered to pale November dawn, Greta lay on her narrow bed thinking about choices and courage and the difference between the two. At 6, she rose, dressed in one of her gray dresses, pinned her hair with hands that had finally stopped shaking, looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and saw a woman who'd aged a decade in 8 weeks. She walked to Colonel Hargrove's office before breakfast, before the camp fully woke, before she could second-guess the decision she'd made somewhere in the darkest hours of night. Hargrove was already there as she'd known he would be. Career military men didn't sleep late. He looked up when she knocked, gestured for her to enter. "Miss Schneider, Sergeant Buchanan said you should rest today." "I know, sir. I'm not here to rest." He studied her face with those assessing eyes that missed nothing. "What are you here for?" "To say I'll continue. The broadcasts, the translations, all of it. Even knowing that Captain Keller might be right, that you might be translating reports about your own family's destruction. Especially knowing that." Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "Because stopping won't change what's true. And if VOA has been honest about everything else, then I need to trust them to be honest about Stuttgart too, even if that honesty destroys me." Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. Not quite approval, but recognition. Respect, possibly. "That's courage, Miss Schneider. Real courage, not the performative kind. It doesn't feel like courage, sir. It feels like I don't have any other choice." "Sometimes those are identical." He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a file with the Red Cross logo visible on its cover. "I wasn't going to show you this yet, but given last night's events, I think you should see it now." He pushed the file across his desk. Greta's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, forms routing information, bureaucratic language in multiple languages. She scanned the text, trying to parse official terminology into meaning. Then she saw it. Buried in the 3rd paragraph of a routing document. "Letter from Joseph and Anna Schneider, Stuttgart, Germany. Processed by International Committee of the Red Cross, Geneva. Cleared for broadcast by Voice of America German Service. Scheduled for November 22nd, Special Program Prisoner Family Correspondence." She looked up at Hargrove, unable to speak, unable to process what she was reading. "They're alive," he said quietly. "As of when they wrote this letter in September, they were alive. The letter is being broadcast in 2 weeks. You'll hear it the same time the prisoners do." The relief hit her with physical force. Her knees went weak, her vision blurred. She gripped the edge of Hargrove's desk to keep from collapsing. Her parents, alive, as of September. Only 2 months ago, which meant recent enough to matter, recent enough to hope. Tears came, but different tears than last night's. Not grief, but release. Not despair, but overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. Thank the Red Cross for maintaining mail channels through war zones. Thank VOA for broadcasting family correspondence." He paused. "And thank yourself for having the courage to keep translating even when you didn't know what you'd hear. That took strength most people don't possess." She stood on shaking legs, wiping her face with hands that wouldn't quite steady. "Tonight's broadcast, sir. I'll be there." "I know you will." November 22nd arrived, wrapped in cold rain that turned the compound into mud. 2 weeks since Keller's attack. 2 weeks of broadcasts that had continued without incident. Keller confined to solitary confinement, the remaining prisoners settling into patterns that felt almost routine. Thomas Weber had sought Greta out 3 times during those weeks. Not for conversation exactly, more for quiet companionship. He seemed to understand that she needed presence without demands, solidarity without questions. They'd sit in the library together, reading in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging observations about books or weather or nothing at all. Klaus Werner had brought her a gift on November 15th, a collection of Goethe poems from the camp library donated months ago by an Austin church. He'd left it on her desk without explanation, but the gesture communicated everything words couldn't. Kindness, recognition, solidarity across the divide of nationality and circumstance. Even some of Keller's former faction had softened toward her. Not all, but enough that the hostility in the mess hall during broadcasts had diminished to wary coexistence. And tonight, Greta stood beside the radio knowing exactly what was coming. Hargrove had briefed her that morning. Special VOA program letters from German POWs to families back home. Transmitted through Red Cross channels, then broadcast so families in Germany would know their loved ones were alive and reasonably well. 15 letters from Camp Winter's prisoners would be read, and the program would include responses letters from Germany that had reached prisoners through the same Red Cross network, including one from Stuttgart. The broadcast began at 1930 with standard news: Allied forces advancing slowly through France against stiffening resistance, Soviet armies pushing westward through Poland, strategic bombing of German industrial targets continuing despite weather challenges. The systematic factual reporting that had become familiar background to their evenings. Then the announcer's voice changed, became warmer, more personal. Tonight we bring you correspondence between German prisoners of war in America and their families in Germany. These letters have been processed through international Red Cross channels and are being broadcast to ensure families know their loved ones are safe. Greta translated, her voice steady despite her hammering heart, despite knowing what was coming. The first letter was read, a young soldier from Munich writing to his mother, reassuring her of his safety, asking about siblings, expressing hope for eventual reunion. The mess hall listened in absolute silence, men hearing their own longing reflected in someone else's words. Second letter, third, fourth, each one a small bridge across the chasm war had created. Then from Thomas Weber, panzer commander captured at Caen, currently interned at Camp Winters, Texas, to his wife Margareta in Stuttgart. Weber sat perfectly still at his usual table, listening to his own words read back to him across thousands of miles and incalculable distance. My dearest Margaret, I am safe and treated according to Geneva Convention protocols. I am healthy, adequately fed, engaged in light agricultural labor. Please tell our children I think of them every night before sleep. Tell them their father will return when this war ends, and I will have much to tell them about what I have learned here, about the difference between truth and comfortable lies, about the courage required to change one's mind when evidence demands it. I love you with everything I am. I will come home. Your Thomas. When Greta finished translating, Weber's eyes were wet. He made no effort to hide his tears, and no one looked away in embarrassment. Grief and longing were universal languages that transcended enemy status. 3 more letters from Camp Winter's prisoners. Then the announcer spoke again. We now share responses from Germany. Letters that have reached prisoners through Red Cross channels, sent by families who want their loved ones to know they survive. Greta's hands gripped the table edge. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. From Joseph and Anna Schneider, Stuttgart, Germany, to their daughter Margaret Schneider, civilian translator, Camp Winters, Texas. The world narrowed to the announcer's voice, to the German words emerging from the radio's speaker, to the truth she'd been desperate to know. Dear Greta, we are alive. The city has been badly damaged, but we survive. Our building was hit by incendiary bombs in August, but we were in the public shelter when it happened. We lost everything we owned, the bakery, our home, all our possessions. We live now with the Hoffman family, old friends from the neighborhood who still have a house standing. Food is scarce and winter will be difficult, but we are managing. We think of you every day and pray you are safe. We received your letter from May saying you are working for the army as a translator. We understand why you took this work. We are proud of you for serving in the only way they would allow. Stay strong, Liebchen. This war will end someday and we will see you again. We love you more than words can express, your mama and papa. The German words washed over Greta like absolution and grief combined. Alive. Building destroyed. Everything lost. Living with friends. Scarce but surviving. Alive. She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, not caring who saw, not caring what it looked like. 287 prisoners watching their translator break down. Understanding exactly why. Because many of them had just heard similar messages about their own families. Proof of life. Proof that connection still existed across vast distances and seemingly unbridgeable divides. The broadcast continued, but Greta couldn't hear through the roaring in her ears. She stood there while tears carved tracks down her face and her parents' voices echoed in her mind through the announcer's reading. We are alive. We are proud of you. We love you. When the broadcast finally ended, Greta couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stand there gripping the table while emotions she'd suppressed for 8 months crashed over her in waves. Thomas Weber approached slowly, Klaus Werner beside him. They stood on the other side of the table, these enemy soldiers who'd become something else over 8 weeks of shared evening rituals. Your parents, Weber said quietly in German, his voice gentle. Stuttgart. I heard the address mentioned. Hoffmann family on Rotabühlstrasse. I know them. Before the war, good people. Your parents are with good people. Thank you, Greta whispered, barely able to form words. Klaus spoke, his young face serious beyond his years. The broadcast was honest, about your parents, about Thomas's family, about all our families, completely honest, something we can verify through other channels. Yes. If they broadcast truth about this, Klaus continued carefully, about things we can independently verify, then perhaps they broadcast truth about everything else too. The logic was simple, devastating, undeniable. If VOA reported accurately about verifiable facts, their other reports were likely accurate too. The entire edifice of distrust that Keller's faction had built was crumbling under the weight of evidence that kept accumulating. Weber pulled something from his pocket, a photograph creased and worn from being carried constantly. He placed it on the table between them. This arrived through Red Cross yesterday. My wife and children. Taken last year before I deployed to France. Greta looked at the photograph through tear-blurred vision, a woman with a kind face and tired eyes. 2 children, maybe 6 and 8 years old, staring solemnly at the camera. A family frozen in time before war tore them apart. They're beautiful, she managed. I thought I would never see this again. Thought everything from my previous life was lost when I was captured. He touched the photograph with infinite gentleness. But VOA facilitated these Red Cross channels, enabled this to reach me. If they were pure propaganda, if they only wanted to manipulate us psychologically, why help us maintain connection with our families? Because propaganda requires consistent deception, Greta said softly, her voice steadier now. But truth can afford to be kind. Sergeant Buchanan approached from his position near the door. Miss Schneider, there's something else. In your office. Colonel Hargrove asked me to make sure you saw it before you left tonight. She followed him on unsteady legs, Weber and Klaus trailing behind at a respectful distance. On her desk sat a package wrapped in brown paper addressed to her in Hargrove's precise handwriting, and beside it, face down as it had been for 8 weeks, the photograph she'd never been able to look at. Buchanan gestured to both items. The colonel thought you might be ready now, for both of them. Her hands shook as she reached for the photograph first, the one she'd carried from Austin, the one she'd kept hidden because confronting it would make everything real in a way she couldn't survive. She turned it over. Her brother William smiled back at her from frozen time. Army uniform crisp and new face, young and hopeful eyes reflecting a future he believed in. The photo had been taken at basic training, sent home with a letter full of optimism and courage and all the things young men believe before war teaches them what reality actually costs. Greta traced his face with one trembling finger. He died at Normandy, Buchanan said quietly. June 6th, first wave. The War Department sent notification to your parents in July, but the letter to you was held up in security clearance for your work here. Colonel Hargrove received confirmation 2 weeks ago. The grief was different now than it would have been in summer. Mediated by time, softened by months of not knowing, almost a relief to have certainty replace terrible suspense. I'm sorry, Weber said from the doorway, for your loss, for all our losses. Greta set down the photograph gently, then turned to the wrapped package, inside an envelope. Not sealed, Hargrove had clearly read it before deciding she should have it. The handwriting was William's, the date at the top, April 1944, 2 months before Normandy, 2 months before his death. She read through fresh tears. Dear Greta, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home and Colonel Hargrove kept his promise to give this to you when you needed it most. I'm writing this before deployment, before whatever comes next, because there are things you need to know. I enlisted to prove we're American, you know that. But I want you to understand something more important. Being German-American isn't something to hide or apologize for. The hyphen doesn't mean divided loyalty, it means enriched identity. I've watched you try to disappear, try to become just Margaret, try to erase the Greta that makes you special. Don't do that. Don't let their fear make you smaller than you are. If this war teaches us anything, it should be that truth matters more than nationality. That honor isn't about which flag you salute, but about how you treat people when no one's watching. That courage means standing in the space between worlds and refusing to choose hatred. Be proud of that hyphen, Greta. It makes you richer, not poorer, stronger, not weaker. Whatever happens, know that I love you, that I'm proud to be your brother, that the best thing our parents did was raise us to be both German and American, to understand that identity is bigger when it contains multitudes. Live that truth. Teach it. Don't let anyone make you choose. Your brother always, William. The letter fell from her hands onto the desk beside William's photograph. She wept for the brother she'd lost, for the future he'd never have, for all the conversations they'd never share. And she wept for the gift he'd given her. Permission to be whole, permission to stop hiding, permission to embrace the complexity that made her who she was. Thomas Weber picked up the letter, carefully read it in silence, then set it down with reverence. Your brother was wise, he said quietly, wiser than most people twice his age. He was 23 when he wrote that, Greta whispered. 23, and he understood what took me 31 years to learn, that identity containing multiple truths is stronger than identity built on single certainty. Klaus spoke from the doorway. May I read it? Greta nodded. Klaus read slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the German, then looked up with something like wonder. This is what I've been trying to understand since arriving here. Why I feel more whole embracing both cultures instead of choosing one. Your brother named it perfectly. They stood in silence, these four people brought together by war and circumstance, and the slow transformation that happened when truth replaced propaganda. November 22nd, 1944, Greta said finally. The day I learned my parents are alive, my brother is dead, and both truths can exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. That's maturity, Weber observed, holding contradictory truths in tension without demanding false resolution. Buchanan cleared his throat gently. It's late. You all should get some rest. Tomorrow's another day. December arrived with cold that finally felt like winter, even to German prisoners accustomed to harsher climates. On December 15th, VOA broadcast something that completed the transformation for many remaining skeptics. A live debate between two German intellectuals in exile in New York, both broadcasting from VOA studios, arguing passionately about Germany's future after the war. The two men disagreed fundamentally. One advocated decentralized federalism, the other a strong central government. They argued with academic rigor and genuine passion, interrupting each other, challenging premises, demanding evidence, engaging in exactly the kind of intellectual combat that hadn't been possible in Germany for over a decade. And VOA simply broadcast it. No intervention, no editorial comment, no attempt to declare a winner or impose a correct position. Thomas Weber listened with the intensity of a man witnessing something he'd thought extinct. When the broadcast ended, he turned to Greta. When was the last time Germans could publicly disagree in Germany? When was the last time competing ideas were allowed to battle in open intellectual combat? Not since 1933, Klaus answered. 12 years. I was 16 then. I can barely remember what free debate sounded like. Weber stood, addressed the room at large. This is how you know propaganda from journalism. Propaganda demands uniformity. Journalism allows, even encourages disagreement. We've been listening to journalism, not propaganda, and it's taken me 3 months to fully accept that. Captain Keller, released from solitary the previous week, sat at his isolated table saying nothing. His face showed no emotion, but his silence spoke volumes. Even he couldn't explain away a broadcast that featured Germans arguing freely without consequence. Christmas Eve arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the 60s, Texas asserting its refusal to conform to calendar expectations. The mess hall had been decorated with modest touches, a small evergreen tree with paper ornaments made by prisoners. Garlands from pine branches gathered during work details, candles waiting to be lit for evening celebration. Colonel Hargrove had authorized a special Christmas meal, roasted turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, cranberry sauce, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Far better than standard rations, approaching abundance that felt surreal given the scarcity pervading much of the world. But before the meal, before the celebration, Greta had one more envelope to open. She sat in her quarters as December afternoon faded into evening, holding the manila envelope Hargrove had given her on September 15th. 3 months and 9 days ago. An eternity compressed into weeks of transformation. Open Christmas Eve. She broke the seal, inside a single sheet of paper. Not Hargrove's handwriting this time, but official War Department letterhead. A note from Hargrove paper-clipped to it. Hargrove's note read, Miss Schneider. Your security clearance was approved before you started work here. The investigation, the monitoring, the restrictions, all necessary protocol for the camp's operation, but never because I doubted your loyalty. You've served with distinction and honor. I hope this Christmas brings you peace. N. Hargrove. The War Department document beneath was her security clearance dated August 20th, 1944. Approved, signed, filed before she'd walked through Camp Winter's gates. He'd trusted her from the beginning. The test was never external. It was whether she could trust herself when everything around her suggested she shouldn't. She sat with that knowledge for a long time, watching Texas sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson through her window. January 1945 brought news that shattered what remained of ideological certainty in the barracks. Detailed VOA reports about concentration camps being discovered as Soviet forces pushed into Poland. The broadcasts were clinical, factual, devastating. Majdanek liberated. Auschwitz discovered. Names, locations, numbers that defied comprehension. Gas chambers, mass graves, industrial-scale murder documented with evidence that couldn't be denied. Greta translated words that made her stomach turn, that made her question how humanity could contain such capacity for systematic evil. The prisoners listened in varying states of denial, horror, and growing acknowledgement. The camp divided again, but differently. Some refused to believe, insisted it was Allied propaganda. Others accepted the reports with quiet horror. And a few, like Thomas Weber, began the agonizing process of understanding what it meant to have served a regime capable of such crimes. By March, as more camps were discovered and documented, even the most committed deniers fell silent. On April 30th, VOA reported Hitler's suicide in Berlin. The war in Europe was collapsing. Surrender was imminent. May 8th brought Victory in Europe Day. Colonel Hargrove assembled the camp in the parade ground under spring sunshine. The war is over, he announced in German. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You are no longer soldiers of a nation at war. You are prisoners awaiting repatriation to a Germany that will need rebuilding from rubble. He paused. You've spent 8 months listening to Voice of America broadcasts. Some of you believed what you heard, some rejected it. Most struggled somewhere between. That struggle is honest. That struggle is human. His eyes swept the assembled prisoners. When you return to Germany, you'll face choices about what kind of nation to build from the ashes. I hope you'll remember that access to truth, even uncomfortable truth, is the foundation of freedom. That societies built on honesty are stronger than societies built on comfortable lies. May 25th brought tragedy no one had anticipated. Photographs arrived from the War Department official documentation of concentration camp discoveries. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Images so horrific they seemed impossible, evidence so overwhelming it destroyed all remaining doubt. Hargrove made viewing voluntary, posted the photographs in the mess hall, allowed prisoners to look or not as they chose. Thomas Weber viewed them. Emerged pale and shaking, went directly to the chapel, stayed there for hours. Klaus Werner viewed them. Vomited afterward, wept like a child. Captain Friedrich Keller initially refused, but something broke in him that afternoon. Guards found him alone in the mess hall after dinner, standing before the photographs he'd spent 8 months denying existed. They found his body in his barracks that night. He'd hanged himself using his belt, a chair kicked aside, a note clutched in one hand. Greta translated it the next morning, her voice breaking. Ich kann nicht in einer Welt leben, wo dies wahr ist. I cannot live in a world where this is true. The funeral was small. Prisoners attended out of respect for a fellow soldier, not agreement with his choices. Hargrove officiated with military precision, honoring the man while acknowledging the tragedy of his death. Greta was asked to speak. She stood before the simple coffin, choosing words carefully. Captain Keller died because he built his entire identity on certainty. When that certainty was revealed as false, he had nothing left to stand on. His tragedy teaches us that we must build our identities on values that can withstand truth, not narratives that crumble when examined. She paused, looking at the assembled faces. We can honor him best by refusing to make the same mistake, by choosing truth over comfortable lies, by building futures on foundations that won't collapse when reality intrudes. Repatriation began in August. Groups of prisoners processed weekly, loaded onto trucks, transported to ports, shipped back to a Germany that existed only in ruins. Thomas Weber left in October. The night before departure, he sought Greta out one final time. I'll find your parents in Stuttgart, he promised. Make sure they know you're safe. Bring word back if I can. You don't have to. Yes, I do. You gave me truth when I needed it. The least I can do is give you peace of mind. He pulled out his worn notebook, the one he'd kept since September. I'm going to become a journalist when I get home. Apply these standards, VOA standards, truth over ideology, facts over propaganda. Germany will need that kind of press to rebuild properly. They shook hands, a gesture that had become natural over months of evening broadcasts and difficult conversations. Klaus Werner stayed. His immigration request approved, he became one of the few prisoners who chose America over return. He moved to Houston, found work teaching German, began building an American life while maintaining the heritage that shaped him. By December 1945, Camp Winters was empty except for staff preparing to close it permanently. Greta's parents arrived in America in December 1946, passage arranged through connections Thomas Weber had facilitated from Germany. He'd found them in Stuttgart, living in the Hoffman's basement, helped them navigate emigration bureaucracy, written letters testifying to their character. The reunion at Austin train station was everything Greta had dreamed of during the dark months of silence. Her father thinner but alive, her mother graying but whole, both of them weeping as they held her, touching her face as if to confirm she was real. Greta, her mother whispered. Our Greta. Not Margaret. Greta. They reopened Schneider's Bakery in 1947. Different location, different building, but the same name. This time the name was pride, not apology. Greta continued working with German-American communities, helping new immigrants navigate the same challenges she'd faced. She never married, poured herself into work, into family, into the mission William had articulated in his final letter. Live in the hyphen prove that identity enriched by multiple heritages is stronger than identity built on single certainty. December 1965, 20 years after the war's end. The German-American Cultural Institute occupied a modest building in downtown Austin. Greta, now 51, silver threading through dark hair, directed it with the same dedication she'd brought to translation work. Two visitors arrived on a cold afternoon: Thomas Weber, distinguished journalist and editor, and Klaus Werner, Houston teacher and American citizen. They met at the old Camp Winters site, now returned to farmland. No buildings remained. But the oak tree they'd planted together in 1945 stood 30 feet tall, branches spreading wide. Thomas brought a book, his memoir just published in Germany. Der Radio, das mich befreite, the radio that freed me. The dedication read, to Greta Schneider, who translated not just words but courage. Klaus brought a photograph, the three of them in 1945, standing beside this oak tree when it was just a sapling. My students ask about the war, Klaus said. I tell them about Camp Winters, about VOA broadcasts, about a translator who showed us that integrity matters more than nationality. Sergeant Ellis Buchanan arrived, now retired, working as a school counselor. He brought his own photograph, his father with a German POW in 1918, smiling like old friends. My father was right, Buchanan said. History repeats. Germans treated well, some stayed, became Americans, we proved it again. They sat beneath the oak tree, these four people bound by shared transformation. What you did, Thomas said to Greta, mattered more than any battle. You showed us that propaganda dies when exposed to consistent truth. I just translated, Greta protested. You did more, Klaus insisted. You showed us we could be proudly German and proudly American, that the hyphen enriches, not divides. That evening, Greta taught her regular class at the Institute. 20 students, children of immigrants from a dozen countries, all navigating hyphenated identities. A young man raised his hand. Miss Schneider, how do you know which truth to believe when everyone claims they're telling it? Greta smiled, thinking of Thomas Weber asking the same question 20 years ago. Here's what I learned, she said. Ask which source welcomes questions, which admits mistakes, which allows disagreement. If they welcome scrutiny, they might be trustworthy. If they demand blind faith, be skeptical. The class ended. Students filed out, carrying lessons that remained relevant across generations. Klaus waited outside. They walked together through Austin streets, past Schneider's bakery, where Greta's parents were closing for the night. Do you ever regret it? Klaus asked. Not having a conventional life? No, because this work matters. Teaching people they can honor multiple heritages without choosing sides. That's legacy enough. That night, Greta sat at her desk in her small apartment. William's photograph sat there, face up now, his smile precious rather than painful. Beside it, her mother's wool gloves, worn but treasured, and Hargrove's letter telling her she'd been trusted from the beginning. She pulled out paper, began writing a reflection for the Institute's newsletter. 20 years ago, I stood beside a radio in a Texas POW camp and helped transform men who'd been fed propaganda all their lives. But the real transformation was my own. I learned that integrity transcends nationality, that courage means questioning everything, including yourself, that identity enriched by complexity is stronger than identity built on certainty. My brother told me to be proud of the hyphen. It doesn't divide, it enriches. That radio freed us all. The prisoners in those barracks, the translator standing beside it. Everyone who learned that truth consistently presented outlasts propaganda. The lesson remains. Build identity on values, not narratives. Values survive when narratives fail, and truth, patient and eternal, belongs to no nation. She set down her pen as Texas night deepened. Outside, an oak tree grew where barbed wire once stood. In Germany, Thomas Weber was writing tomorrow's editorial, applying standards learned in captivity. In Houston, Klaus Werner was grading papers, teaching students to think critically. And Greta Schneider carried forward the mission that had defined her life, teaching that the space between worlds is not emptiness to fear, but richness to celebrate. One truth at a time, one student at a time, one generation at a time. The radio that changed everything was long gone, dismantled decades ago, its physical form lost to history. But its lesson echoed forward: you cannot defeat lies with better lies. Only with stubborn, uncomfortable, complicated truth. And truth, she had learned, has no nationality.